When agents entered his Texas apartment, they found the chemicals for an explosive already assembled, but no explosion had happened yet. Khalid Alim Aldosari came to the United States as a young man on a student visa. He said he wanted to study chemical engineering. On paper, he looked like many students who moved to a college town to study and build a life far from home. But behind that ordinary appearance, federal investigators later said he was collecting chemicals, buying lab equipment, and keeping notes. These notes suggested he planned to make an improvised explosive device and target U.S. locations. The case moved quickly. Suspicious purchases led to a federal investigation. Then it went to a jury, and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison. Local authorities in Lubbock and federal prosecutors in Amarillo said the investigation stopped a dangerous plan before anyone was harmed. Authorities first noticed a red flag when Aldosari ordered concentrated phenol. This chemical can be used in labs, but it can also be combined with other substances to make explosives. A supplier thought the order was unusual and alerted law enforcement. From there, investigators tracked his other purchases and online searches. The FBI also recovered journal entries and emails from his computer. These writings included statements that showed he wanted to target Americans and discussed carrying out harmful acts. Prosecutors said the materials and steps he had taken meant he was very close to completing a dangerous device. So, how close was he? The evidence at trial showed more than just curiosity. Aldosari had bought lab items and supplies that, together, could be made into an explosive device. He also tracked potential targets, including infrastructure and the Dallas home of former President George W. Bush. He even wrote about applying for a U.S. scholarship to put himself closer to potential targets. Prosecutors said these were substantial steps toward building a device. The defense argued he had not threatened anyone directly and had not finished a working device. The jury considered this and found him guilty of attempting to use a weapon of mass disruption. The arrest was carefully planned. After the supplier raised concerns, the FBI monitored Aldosari's orders to prevent any dangerous activity. In February of 2011, agents in Texas arrested the then 20-year-old. From the federal perspective, the timeline mattered. He had bought materials, researched targets, and kept written notes suggesting he planned to act. These steps met the legal standard for attempted use of a weapon of mass disruption. The FBI later described the case publicly as an example of catching someone one step away from finishing a dangerous plan. In court, the jury focused on the combination of purchases, writings, and online research. The prosecution said Aldosari was not just curious about chemistry, he was actively preparing a device and planning to use it in the U.S. The defense argued the materials alone did not make a finished device. They also suggested that some online writings reflected fantasy rather than real intent. Still, in June of 2012, the jury found him guilty. In November of the same year, the judge sentenced him to life in prison. The Justice Department said his steps were serious enough to deserve the maximum penalty. Why would a student take this path? Court papers and news reports give a partial answer. The writings recovered by the FBI suggested an ideological motive. Aldosari's notes described wanting to strike Americans and framed those actions within extremist interpretations of jihad. He apparently told people and wrote in private notes about wanting to act in the name of that cause. Investigators also pointed to his decision to study in the U.S. as a way to get closer to potential targets. His motivation, according to prosecutors, combined political beliefs, grievances, and a plan to use his technical knowledge for something dangerous. The trial was not the end of the story. Aldosari appealed. He raised typical issues in federal cases, including whether some evidence should have been excluded, whether jury instructions were correct, and whether his sentence was calculated properly. The Fifth Circuit reviewed the case and confirmed both the conviction and the life sentence. The appeals court found no mistakes in the key rulings. The jury's verdict stood, and Aldosari remains in prison to serve his sentence. The next case began with 3 men in a car and ended with federal agents calling it the most chilling, hate-motivated sprees of the 1990s. Ricky Rivera Mungia appears in public records connected to one of the most frightening, racially motivated acts of the 1990s. He was one of 3 young men who, on the night of October 16, 1994, drove through the streets of Lubbock, Texas. They were looking for black men to approach and shoot at close range. This was not a random fight or a sudden argument. Investigators and later federal prosecutors described it as a planned targeting, meant to terrorize and harm. The 3 men talked openly about race, and about causing wider conflict before leaving. Their actions that night took one man's life and two others seriously injured. The group moved through city streets, stopping next to strangers and luring them toward their car. They used a short-barreled shotgun at close range. One of the victims, Melvin Johnson, aged 37, did not survive. Two others, Autry Morgan Vaughn Jr. and Triellis Lee Stewart, were seriously injured but lived. Law enforcement quickly connected the incidents and arrested three suspects: Roy Ray Martin, Eli Trevino Mungia, and Ricky Rivera Mungia. Investigators found that the men had discussed their hatred for black people and their desire to start a race conflict. Federal authorities also got involved because the acts violated civil rights in addition to firearm laws. The investigation included local detectives, the FBI, and the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. At trial, the evidence showed planning and intent, not randomness. Witnesses and physical evidence confirmed that the men had coordinated their actions. They had chosen victims because of race and used a weapon that made close-range acts especially dangerous. The federal charges included conspiracy to violate civil rights, interference with federally protected activities, in other words, trying to take away people's right to move safely in public, and gun law violations related to the shotgun. Prosecutors considered the possibility of maximum penalties under federal law, but decided to seek long-term prison sentences instead. In November 1995, a federal jury found all three men guilty on the federal charges. News coverage at the time highlighted the openly expressed hatred the men showed. One defendant had links to skinhead groups. The two cousins who joined him spoke about wanting to eliminate black people and start a revolution. The courtroom heard from the victims and learned how the acts were carried out. The jury found the men guilty on civil rights and weapon charges. The case sent a clear message that racially motivated acts would not be treated as ordinary street incidents, but as violations of civil rights and public safety. In April 1996, U.S. District Judge Sam Cummings sentenced Roy Ray Martin, Eli Trevino Mungia, and Ricky Rivera Mungia to life in prison. The sentences reflected the seriousness of an act meant to frighten an entire community. Court records and press accounts also noted that the men received additional decades for firearm violations. For the victims' families and the Lubbock community, the sentences officially ended the legal process but could not undo the harm. One man had passed, two others were injured, and the city had to face the reality of organized racial hatred in its streets. Evidence presented at trial showed that the three men were motivated by ideology, not personal disputes. They had been exposed to white supremacist ideas, were linked to skinhead groups, and spoke about starting a race conflict. Their goal was to frighten people selectively. The prosecution showed that this was not a single moment of anger. It was the result of planning, conversations, and preparations that built up to that night in October. When asked why they targeted strangers, the answer was simple. They believed harming people of a certain race would advance their goal of creating conflict. Courtroom testimony included witnesses recalling the chaotic moments, forensic evidence linking the weapon to the events, and conversations in which the defendants allegedly planned their spree. The defense tried different approaches, including questioning intent and the strength of the evidence. Still, the jury concluded that the shootings were racially motivated and that the weapons charges were valid. The verdicts meant that each defendant would serve a life sentence in the federal prison system. After sentencing, Ricky Rivera Mungia entered the federal system. Over the years, he was moved between institutions. Public listings show him as a federal inmate serving life. More recent records list him at high-security facilities, including the United States Penitentiary in Pollock, Louisiana. Now, what makes an ordinary IT worker from Toronto decide to become the voice of terror? Mohammed Khalifa's life went from a normal start in Canada to a life in a U.S. federal prison. He was born in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in 1983. Later, he moved to Canada. There, he studied and worked in information technology. Colleagues remembered him as someone skilled with computers, but prosecutors later described him as someone who used his skills and knowledge of English and Arabic to become a central figure in one of the most extreme propaganda operations of the last decade. His story stands out because a technical professional turned into a public figure spreading harm. The charges against him were serious. U.S. prosecutors said he went to Syria in 2013, intending to join a militant group. He pledged loyalty to the group's leadership. Within months, He joined their media team because of his language skills. From 2014, he worked as a narrator and translator for English language materials. By 2016, he was managing networks of supporters who helped translate, produce, and share the group's content to Western audiences. Prosecutors said his work actively recruited fighters, normalized harm, and publicized acts of extreme brutality. Khalifa was seen not just as a voice in videos, but as someone whose actions contributed to real harm. The main evidence in court was a series of graphic videos. 2 of them were called Flames of War and Flames of War 2. These videos combined battle footage, acts of brutality, and narration aimed at English speakers. Khalifa did more than provide voiceovers. He narrated scenes showing prisoners digging graves and then being harmed. In at least 2 videos, he appeared on camera harming captured Syrian soldiers. Prosecutors said these videos were part of a campaign meant to glorify harm and inspire followers abroad. Court documents detailed how the videos were produced, distributed, and how Khalifa's narration amplified their impact. Why would someone from Toronto become the narrator and participant in these videos? The answer is a mix of online radicalization, travel with intent to join the group, and willingness to join their media team. Khalifa told investigators that he left Canada in 2013 to be a fighter. Once in Syria, he pledged loyalty and moved into translation and media work because of his English and Arabic skills. He later admitted to FBI agents that he narrated the high-profile videos and directly harmed 2 Syrian soldiers. His story shows how personal choices, recruitment, and technical skills combined to make him both a fighter and media figure. The videos Khalifa worked on were not simple recordings. They were made to reach Western audiences. They explained the group's actions in English and used battlefield imagery to promote their ideology. Analysts called the Flames of War videos influential because of their scale and technical quality. They had long runtimes, first-person combat footage, and English narration that addressed potential followers in Europe and North America. Prisoners in the videos were forced to dig graves before being harmed. The narration explained and justified these actions. Prosecutors said the videos encouraged danger, influenced viewers, and gave moral support to those committing harmful acts. Khalifa's activities went beyond media work. Court documents describe a firefight in January 2019 in Abu Badran, Syria. Khalifa engaged a position held by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Armed with an AK-47 and grenades, he tried to fight but had to surrender when his weapon jammed and he ran out of options. This capture led to his transfer to U.S. custody. It was his capture on the battlefield, not an arrest in North America, that brought him before U.S. prosecutors. U.S. authorities charged him because of the results of his media work. He was accused of helping a designated militant group in ways that led to harm. The law allows U.S. officials to pursue people who provide resources, including propaganda and translation, when those actions are tied to harmful outcomes. Khalifa was flown to the Eastern District of Virginia. He appeared in court for the first time in October 2021. In December of that year, he pleaded guilty to the main charge. The plea recognized that his actions were part of a chain that caused harm. In court, prosecutors said he did more than narrate videos. They said he helped recruit followers, produce harmful content, and participate in fights. Defense reports noted that some public reports about him came from interviews and later verification. Once in U.S. custody, his legal process moved quickly. He pleaded guilty in December 2021. In July 2022, he was sentenced to life in prison. Officials said the sentence reflected both his direct acts and his leadership role in spreading propaganda. For years, the next man had been just another inmate. Then one morning, he reminded everyone what he was capable of. And if you find stories like these important, consider subscribing. James Edward Rose first appeared in public records not as a familiar name, but as someone flagged for being dangerous in a federal prison. By November 2010, he was already serving time for serious federal offenses. A routine cell check at the United States Penitentiary in McNair, Kentucky, quickly turned chaotic. 2 correctional officers went into his cell for a standard search. Instead, Rose targeted them with a homemade blade, injuring both. Staff rushed to treat serious injuries, and the incident shocked everyone at the prison. This led to a new federal case. eventually adding a life sentence to Rose's long legal record. Before the McNair incident, Rose was already well known in the federal system. Reports describe him as an inmate with a long history of serious offenses. He was serving time for armed bank theft and tampering with witnesses when the 2010 incident occurred. His previous convictions had already placed him in federal custody, and his record suggested he would go beyond boundaries most people would not cross. That pattern, escalating from major offenses to targeting officers, became a key point in court. Prosecutors argued that it justified a strict, long-term sentence. The act itself was sudden and harmful. While officers conducted the search, Rose used a makeshift blade to strike 2 officers in the chest, back, and shoulder. Both were rushed to a hospital with serious injuries, but they eventually recovered. Investigators spent days inspecting the cell, interviewing witnesses, and figuring out how an inmate had made a weapon and used it at the worst possible moment for the officers. This was not a random fight. It happened during an official security procedure, making it one of the most serious acts a person in custody can commit. People asked why Rose would target officers during a routine check. The public records do not give a clear reason. Motives in prison can vary, like personal grudges, perceived disrespect, resisting procedures, or trying to gain leverage through harm. In Rose's case, reports focus more on what happened than why it happened. Courts responded to the outcome. 2 officers were harmed by a weapon made inside the cell during an official procedure. Prosecutors described it as an act planned enough to make a weapon in a cell. In federal court, prison cases are carefully examined. Prosecutors charged Rose with causing serious injury to federal officers. Evidence included eyewitness accounts from staff and inmates, physical evidence of the improvised weapon, and hospital reports documenting the officer's injuries. The defense likely questioned intent and the sequence of events, but the main fact stayed the same. Rose struck officers during an official procedure. Considering his past convictions and the immediate danger to staff, the court saw the act as severe enough for a life sentence. In 2011, Rose was convicted and given life in federal custody. The next man built an empire out of music, and prosecutors said he used it to hide something far darker. James Rosemond was a man with 2 sides to his life. Publicly, he was involved in music. Privately, federal authorities said he ran a life full of danger and money from illegal activities. He grew up in New York. His parents were Haitian immigrants. Rosemond worked hard to enter the music business. He managed artists, ran Czar Entertainment, and connected with well-known hip-hop figures. However, the authorities presented a different picture at trial. They said Rosemond led a cross-country network that moved large amounts of illegal substances between Los Angeles and New York. They said he used the music business as a cover. In 2 separate trials in 2013 and 2014, federal juries found him guilty of long-running illegal substance distribution, money laundering, firearms offenses, and related acts. He was sentenced to life for those offenses. The central case that followed began with a personal incident that should have stayed private. In March of 2007, Rosemond's 14-year-old son was reportedly confronted and harmed by members of a rival group called G Unit. This included Marvin Tony Yayo, Bernard, and Lowell Lodi Mac Fletcher. The boy was not seriously hurt, but the incident made Rosemond very angry. Fletcher later served time for his role in this episode. Authorities said Rosemond's anger led to a promise of payback. When Fletcher left prison in 2009, Rosemond allegedly recruited people from his network. He offered at least $30,000 and, according to prosecutors, even provided a kilogram of illegal substances as payment to have Fletcher targeted. On the night of September 27, 2009, Fletcher was lured to a quiet spot in the Bronx and shot multiple times. He passed that night. Authorities said Rosemond supplied the gun, a small-caliber handgun with a silencer, and helped organize the plan. The big question in all this was, why? Prosecutors said it started with a father's anger over what happened to his son. Rosemond had the connections and resources to turn anger into action. He was already involved in organized distribution and had connections to individuals prepared to take extreme measures for payment. In this position, arranging payback became something he could do. Rosemond's legal story was complicated. He was arrested and charged in 2012 for both his distribution network and the later payback accusations. The case about arranging Fletcher's targeting went to 3 separate trials. The first trial in early 2014 ended without a decision from the jury. In December of 2014, a jury convicted him of ordering Fletcher's targeting. In March of 2015, Judge Colleen McMahon sentenced him to life plus 20 years for the targeting counts, in addition to the life term he already faced for distribution. The legal battle did not end there. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals found errors in the trial and ordered a new one in 2016. Rosemond was retried, convicted again in late 2017, and after that trial, he received life plus 30 years in November of 2018. The government said, and the juries, agreed that Rosemond used his network to hire people for harmful acts when he wanted results. Prosecutors proved this complicated plan through several points. They used witnesses who explained the steps Rosemond took. They presented evidence of payment, including claims that a kilogram of illegal substances was used to pay the crew. Phone records and testimony connected the gun used back to Rosemond. Witnesses said Rosemond promised payment and gave directions. The defense argued these witnesses had reasons to lie. This argument led to the first trial ending without a decision. Yet, in the second and third trials, juries found the witness accounts credible. At sentencing, Rosemond's lawyers pushed back strongly. They argued witnesses exaggerated and that Rosemond had not intended for Fletcher to be harmed in that way. They said he had only authorized some intimidation, not serious harm. They also pointed out inconsistencies in witness accounts. Some of these arguments led appeals courts to order a retrial. Still, after the third trial, the courts upheld the conviction, and Rosemond was left to serve consecutive life terms. The next man, who once wore a military uniform, would become one of the most ingenious escape artists the U.S. prison system had ever seen. Richard Lee McNair was a man who looked ordinary on the outside, but hid a sharp, dangerous side. He was born in Altus, Oklahoma, in December 1958. He spent time in the Air Force and worked as a military police officer at Minot Air Force Base. Later, his life took a dark turn and eventually became defined by his repeated attempts to escape custody. The event that started everything happened on a cold November night in 1987. It took place at a grain elevator on the edge of Minot, North Dakota. McNair went there to steal from the Farmers Union elevator. What started as theft escalated when he was confronted. Jerome, also called Jerry Theus, a trucker and elevator worker, was shot and passed. Another man, Richard Kitzman, was shot multiple times and lost his life. He survived by pretending to be unconscious and later crawled to a phone to call for help. Investigators arrived to find red stains, a ransacked office, and panic in the town. This became the start of McNair's long time in prison and his years on the run. Police quickly focused on McNair because of his ties to Minot through the Air Force. He became the main suspect after stolen goods, and other evidence were linked to him. In early 1988, he admitted guilt for the fatal shooting, the injuries to Kitzman, and the theft. He received very heavy sentences, 2 life terms for the fatal shooting and injuries, plus extra years for the burglary. Prison did not stop McNair. Almost immediately, he began attempting escapes. At first, he tried small tricks, like using lip balm to slip out of handcuffs and chiseling at cell blocks. Later, he made more complex plans, showing he was determined to be free. Why did a man who had worn a uniform turn dangerous? There is no simple answer. Court records show that McNair acted aggressive when caught. He had been caught stealing before and had worked as a police informant, both stressful roles. The theft itself triggered the fatal encounter, but McNair's history shows he was willing to take extreme risks to avoid trouble. McNair proved to be patient and inventive in custody. His first major escape happened in 1992 at the North Dakota State Penitentiary in Bismarck. He and 2 others crawled through a ventilation duct to get out. The others were quickly found, but this showed McNair's ability to plan and act under pressure. Later, in the federal prison system, he ended up at the United States Penitentiary in Pollock, Louisiana. He worked repairing old mailbags in a factory area. He used this job to watch routines, notice breaks, and learn how pallets were moved. On April 5, 2006, he pulled off a famous escape. He built a small shelter inside a pallet of mailbags, added an air tube, and had it shrink-wrapped. The pallet was moved outside by forklift, and when left unattended, McNair freed himself and simply walked away. The image of him mailing himself out of prison became widely known and embarrassed the authorities. Escaping was one thing, staying free was another. McNair moved carefully across Canada, living quietly and using false papers and vehicles. He even watched news reports about himself and changed his behavior when recognized. On one occasion, a police officer spotted him jogging but let him go because he seemed ordinary. His freedom ended in October 2007 when an off-duty Canadian police officer noticed a suspicious van. The next day, a rookie officer found the van, chased it slowly, and caught McNair after a short-foot pursuit. McNair later called the arrest just one of those days. Back in custody, McNair faced additional proceedings for his escape. Authorities moved him to several high-security facilities to prevent another attempt. Interviews and letters show he wrote about life in supermax prisons and sometimes seemed amused by media coverage. The record also shows a man who had seriously hurt another person and repeatedly tried to run from accountability. His original life sentences remained in effect, and the escape added federal penalties and attention on how to handle someone with his skills. McNair's legal case had several phases. After his initial arrest, he admitted guilt for the Minot shooting and injuries in 1988. This avoided a long trial, but he received life sentences. Later, his escape and cross-border flight led to more arrests and hearings. For security, some hearings were held at prisons instead of public courts. The result was always the same. McNair remained a life-sentenced inmate with extra federal penalties for escaping. The next case began as a credit card scam and ended with a judge injured in her own driveway. Onyeri was not always known for serious acts. Early on, he appeared in reports as someone involved in hustles, music, and small-time scams. Over time, these activities escalated into something much more serious. Details about his childhood and exact birth date are not publicly clear. What is known is the path that led him from running scams in Houston to planning something dangerous. One of his main goals became stopping a judge from sending him to prison. This plan, carried out one night outside Judge Julie Kokorek's home in Austin, triggered a federal investigation. That investigation eventually exposed a large network of illegal operations and landed Onyeri in prison for life. Onyeri's history, as prosecutors explained in court, mixed financial scams with growing threats of harm. He and his associates ran fraud schemes involving credit cards, debit cards, and fake tax refunds. These schemes brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars. The money was used to support a lavish lifestyle and, according to prosecutors, to keep the scams running. Federal agents linked this network of lies, fake documents, and bribes to a plan that escalated from fraud to a harmful act when Onyeri feared losing his freedom. Testimony and evidence painted him as someone who reacted strongly when his operations were threatened. The turning point came on the night of November 6, 2015. Judge Julie Kokorek, a respected Texas state judge, was returning home with her family after a high school football game. Onyeri's plan, meant to scare the judge, seriously escalated. A bag was placed in her driveway to block her gate. When family members stepped out, an explosion went off, shattering the quiet street. The judge suffered severe injuries, including permanent damage to a hand, and her family was left in shock. Investigators quickly linked the act to Onyeri and others connected to the fraud network. Prosecutors argued that Onyeri, fearing a probation violation would send him back to prison, had moved from threats to action. Why would someone involved in fraud try something so extreme? The trial suggested it was fear. Onyeri had been arrested in June 2015 and appeared in front of Judge Kokorek. Prosecutors said he believed she would send him to prison. Soon after leaving court, he reportedly began researching her online and planning the act. The prosecution argued this was not a sudden act. It was a calculated plan by someone who thought a harmful act could protect his operations. The motive, to avoid prison and protect illegal income, ran throughout the case. The act was the end of a long series of crimes. The investigation that followed was careful and thorough. Agents from the FBI, IRS criminal investigation and state authorities reviewed bank records, intercepted communications, and collected witness statements. Evidence showed patterns of fraudulent refund claims, stolen cards, fake documents, and payments linked to people who could carry out such actions. Prosecutors showed this was not just fraud. It was a network where harm was used to protect the operations. In April 2018, a federal jury found Onyeri guilty on multiple counts, including running a racketeering network, fraud, and attempted harm toward Judge Kokurek. During the trial, Onyeri sometimes spoke for himself. He admitted shooting at the judge's vehicle, but tried to claim he only meant to scare. The judge described the explosion, the fear, and the lasting damage to her hand. Prosecutors argued the sequence of stalking, planning, placing a device, and firing the weapon showed intent. The defense argued he did not plan serious harm, that his role was misunderstood, and that some responsibility belonged to others. The jury, after reviewing the evidence and testimony, found him guilty on the main charges. In April 2018, the conviction was finalized. During the sentencing hearing, victims spoke and Onyeri gave a long statement. A federal judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of release on October 2, 2018. Onyeri spoke about his birthday and claimed he had never hurt a woman, saying, "My whole life, I never harmed a woman." The court, however, focused on the pattern of actions and the harm caused, giving the maximum punishment. The sentence also included financial restitution for losses from his scams. In the years after, Onyeri appealed the conviction. His lawyers challenged parts of the trial, but federal courts upheld the verdict and life sentence. A 2023 ruling confirmed that the trial had been fair and that the sentence should stand. This closed the federal route for overturning the conviction. Onyeri continues to serve his sentence under the assigned registry number. The next act revealed how even maximum security and control can vanish in seconds. Charles Lee White was born in 1970. He is currently serving time at the United States Penitentiary Pollock in Louisiana. Before moving to Pollock, White was at USP Lee in Virginia. He was serving a life sentence for racketeering, which included charges involving serious physical harm to others. His history shows a pattern of increasingly dangerous behavior. This eventually led to a major incident involving prison staff in 2017. In January 2017, during a routine cell check in the Maximum Security Unit B2 at USP Pollock, White acted aggressively along with another inmate, Marco Damon Duncan. Duncan was also serving a life sentence. They confronted two staff members, Counselor Eric Farmer and Corrections Officer Remington Steedley, while the officers were conducting the check. White used a shank and targeted both staff members. The injuries were serious and life-threatening. The act was quick and clearly planned. After the incident, White was charged with attempted serious bodily harm. On March 2018, he went on trial for 3 days. The jury found him guilty. Evidence showed that White had planned the event ahead of time. The defense could not provide enough evidence to change the outcome. White was sentenced to an extra 20 years in federal prison, which is added on top of his life sentence. The reasons behind White's actions are not fully known. Experts suggest it may have been a way to challenge the prison system, show power among other inmates, or react to personal grievances. Since White has not spoken publicly about it, the exact motive is unclear. As of 2025, Charles Lee White is 55 years old. He is still serving his sentences at USP Pollock, a facility that houses some of the most dangerous inmates in the country. His actions in 2017 reinforced his reputation as a high-risk individual. He remains under strict supervision within the Bureau of Prisons.